Okay, so I just saw this Saturday Night Live sketch weekend update on Russian hacking. And this is Kate McKinnon again. They're featured, what to call her, their demoness. I don't know what she is, but she plays this poor Russian immigrant, this suicidal Russian village lady. Now, there was quite a number of Russians that I met in India that do our heartfulness meditation system, and they're nothing like this. This is an unbelievably backward stereotype. This woman claims to be suicidal because of the poor living conditions. She talks about hacking, the Russians hacking, and she says all Russian people aren't evil. And where does that all come from? Where does these stereotypes and this hostility towards Russia come from all of a sudden? And then the most inflammatory charge is the fake news correspondent guy asks her about, everyone's talking about the possibility of World War III with Russia, nuclear war with Russia. And I was watching this with my sort of jaw dropped open. How did we get here? I mean, this moved along rather quickly. When within a year, just like with the gender fluid movement, just within a year, we're talking about nuclear war with Russia, where that hadn't been talked about for many years. When I grew up in the 1980s, the Russians were always the villains in movies and all these things. The villains were always the Russians, and this is when they were raising huge amounts of money for the Cold War, and this was to support the military-industrial complex. Very few people actually thought there was nuclear war, and there wasn't any real outward tension. And then you could see this change, where the Russian villains, in movies, the Russians ceased to be villains anymore, and then you had crazy Islamic terrorists were now the villains. Back to the Future, it was the Libyans. It was just always these radical Islamic terrorists. And then you see now, in more recent days, it's been right-wing people who live in America, crazy right-wing terrorists. So this is where, and again, there was no evidence that we were going to have a war with Russia. There was no outward tension. There was no military conflict like there was in Syria and these things back then. And there was no terroristic events before these guys were put out there as terrorists in these movies and TV. The Islamic terrorists, the radical Islamic terrorists, there was no events. There was no events on American soil. There was just nothing. And then they made them the villains, and then all of a sudden these things started to happen. So we were being conditioned to believe in these different things. And then, like I said, it went into these homegrown terrorists and the shooters, things that are representation of Sandy Hook and these types of things. They became the villains in TV shows, police shows, and these things. And now the Russians are back in there. Now they're scripting the Russians into this villain role. It was really disrespectful, really, really unfunny sketch on Saturday Night Live, and putting out all these ideas like we're going to have war with Russia. Why are you putting that idea out there? Why even talking about that? Why is there even a need for Russia? Because the war with Russia ends up in basically the nuclear destruction of the world. So this is not comic fodder. I mean, this is the most serious thing right now for everybody, because nuclear war basically wrecks the game. The game's over when there's nuclear war. And then even the people living out in the country who are trying to survive and these types of things, people who could maybe eke out a living after the civilization collapses, has to deal with radioactive contamination for, years and years and years. Horrible thing. And so that would be something that you don't want to joke about, you don't want to provoke. Certainly this idea of them hacking is not been borne out. They're talking about like it's fact in the mainstream news, and certainly here on Saturday Night Live. I read that report. It says it gives no evidence that the Russians were involved in any sort of hacking scandal. And they talk about RT, Russia Today, which gives more accurate news to people in the truth community. We know that Russia Today gives more accurate news than the mainstream media. So they give these two things as Russia Today being a propaganda network and that they believe with extreme confidence that the Russians were involved with the hacking. The Central Intelligence Agencies, the so-called intelligence community, are saying with extreme confidence we believe that the Russians were involved. Take our word for it. Well, I really don't want to take your word for it, especially if this is leading to nuclear war. I'd like to have some actual evidence. They put out these reports all the time, like the 9/11 Commission, and they say, yeah, this is fact now. And the reports don't have anything in them. They don't have any proof. And then that's considered real news. And then it can be quoted from, and the news people can say, yeah, this was said, and everybody who doesn't do research said, oh, this really happened. And then you're provoking something. It's beyond the point of no return when you get into a nuclear war with Russia. And they really are pushing for this. There's no recovering from that. It's just like Einstein said. I don't know what weapons will be used in World War III, but I know the weapons they'll use in World War IV is sticks and stones, which is a great quote. But as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure 90% of Americans, 99% of Americans are concerned, and probably 99% of Russians are concerned, Syria and this alleged hacking scandal aren't worth nuclear war. The stuff that's going on there. So what's really going on? Why are they pushing for this? They're obviously pushing for this in a variety of different ways. All right, the link is in the description box. It's really not worth watching, but it's definitely something to be concerned about. This is Paul Romano reporting from the apocalypse. Everybody have a blessed day.